Welcome to Drisha's Erev Hanukkah Boker Yun. This session is Hallel on Hanukkah, a Hassidic perspective on Halakhic Enigma with Rabbanit Leora Balinsky. In this shiur, we will utilize halachic sources together with the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter, the Sefas Emes, to explore the unique nature of the obligation to recite full Hallel on Hanukkah. For those who have not had the pleasure of learning with her, Rabbanit Leora Balinsky is a teacher of Torah at Midrashet Amodim, as well as a Ram and Mashkicha Ruchanit. And we're always happy to have her back here teaching. And I want to hand things over to you.
Okay, Kayla, thank you so much. It's good to be in this dynamic again. Last time I taught for Drisha was this summer, and it's nice to be able to see Kayla again in this forum and also the rest of you. So good morning / good evening, depending where you are in the world, as Kayla said. I happen to be in Israel right now, so it's really special to be able to inaugurate Hanukkah this way with all of you here. And what we're going to be discussing today. Oh, sorry, I heard something. Maybe I didn't. Okay. What we're going to be discussing today is Hallel and Hanukkah, the connection between the two. And what we're going to be really focusing on is looking at the places where we're going to first focus on investigation of what is Hallel, where does it come from? And then we're going to look at Hallel and Hanukkah specifically. And we're going to then look at Hallel and Hanukkah through the lens of the Sefas Emes, who will give us another perspective on the connection between Hallel and Hanukkah that we established beforehand. So let's start. Let's go. And please feel free to stop me for questions. That would be great. And I will obviously answer them to the best of my ability. And I'm really excited to kick off this learning. So in general, at least growing up, my association with Hallel was actually something that was mainly on Rosh Chodesh, because it was what would happen most frequently and was the most regular part of my life that I experienced Hallel was Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. And my associations with Hallel is this beautiful, beautiful singing. Sometimes not so beautiful, depending on where you're davening. But I never really understood the connection between Hallel and what we were doing on Rosh Chodesh so much. This year, we'll dafka not so much focus on that, but we're going to focus more on the other times that we say Hallel and then mention Rosh Chodesh as well. And then get to what is the deal with Hallel and Hanukkah. One connection that immediately comes to mind in terms of Hallel and Hanukkah for me is what we say in Al Hanisim, which we say during davening and during benching on Hanukkah, where we end off Al Hanisim after talking about the after talking about the military victory and after talking about the miracle, we end off by saying, "V'kavu shmonat yimei Chanukah elu lehodot ulehalel l'shimcha hagadol," that these days of Hanukkah were instituted in order to give thanks and to praise lehalel, the word Hallel, to your great name. That there's some connection between experiencing the miracle and Hallel that is inherent. And so I think intuitively, or based off of just experiencing Hanukkah, it seems like because we have this miracle, there's something very natural about thanking God for it in the form of Hallel. But now let's take a step back and examine different sources of Hallel that speak about where Hallel came from and what it's all about. So Hallel contains or comprises chapters 113 through 118 of Psalms of Tehillim. And whereas half Hallel, which is said on Rosh Chodesh and the last six days of Pesach, contain only parts of that. That's like the basic structure of what Hallel actually is. And so the first question that I want us to examine a little bit is, what is the status of Hallel in terms of the mitzvah of it? Is the mitzvah to say Hallel, the fact that we do Hallel, is that something that is d'oraita? Is that something that is considered to be a commandment from the Torah, or is it something that's considered to be d'Rabbanan? Is it considered to be a only a rabbinic obligation? And so we're going to briefly look at three different sources in the Gemara that all seem to imply something different. And so we're going to start off with source 1, which I will now share my screen finally. Here we go. So anyone who wants to follow along with your own sources, please feel free to do so. And we're going to start off in source 1 here. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Is it too small or anything?
It's
fine. We can enlarge if we want to.
Here, does that help at all? Maybe not. Okay, great. So we're going to start off with this first source in Masechet Tanit. And this source says as follows. We're starting off in the picking up off in the middle, a bit of the middle of a discussion, where we're talking about Hallel and Rosh Chodesh. Amar Rava said, Zot omeret, Halela de Berish Yarcha, lav deoraita. When trying to understand Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, specifically relating to something previously that comes up in the Mishnah about what we do on Rosh Chodesh, Rava says the reason that the Mishnah is phrased in such a way is in order to tell us that the Hallel of Rosh Chodesh is not deoraita. So if the Hallel of Rosh Chodesh is not deoraita, what would that presumably mean about other Hallels? If the Mishnah is going out of its way, let's say in the way it's phrased, to tell us that
then they
Hallel
are deoraita.
Exactly, right? So this would seem to imply that other Hallel is deoraita. This next section isn't well, I skip it for now. I just love it. Okay, so we have to read this too. I can't not. So we're next told that Rav Ikla Bavel, we skip a little bit to get to this part. Rav Ikla Bavel, that Rav showed up in Bavel, Chazanu Dekakaru Halela Barash Yarcha, and he saw that they were saying Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Savar Lafsikinhu, and he thought to stop them because it's not a mitzvah to say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Why are they doing that? Also, not only why are they doing that, maybe it's even a problem if you say a bracha on your Hallel, that it's a problem of saying a bracha levatala. It's a problem of saying a bracha that isn't actually connected to anything, and thus it's a sort of wasted bracha, which isn't supposed to be done. Kevan dechaza dekamedalge deluge amar shmamina minhagavatehem beadehem. When he saw that they were skipping around in Hallel, that they weren't saying the entirety of Hallel, that they were omitting sections of Hallel, he said, okay, I can see that there is some maintenance of the custom of their forefathers, that they aren't just violating a precept, but rather that there must be some reason why they're doing this. We're gonna stop there. So I think this illustrates that the status of Rosh Chodesh, Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, is one of perhaps seemingly from here minhag, one of some sort of binding communal practice, which is still practiced today. That's certainly not deoraita, but the Gemara seems to imply that other Hallel is. So what we get from the image of general Hallel that we get from Masechet Tanit is that Hallel is deoraita, generally speaking. So now let's move on to source 2, which is from Masechet Brachot. And now we are talking about what happens when we are saying Hallel or reading the Megillah, and we're going to see the comparison between Purim and Hanukkah, Hallel and the Megillah later on today as well. What happens in that situation in terms of what are you able to interrupt or not? Interrupt the recitation of it in order to greet someone. So ba'amine acha, ba'amine achai, tana debe Rabbi Chia me Rabbi Chia. B'Hallel uva Megillah mahu she'afsik. What is the halacha with regard to Hallel and Megillah when you're saying Hallel, reading Megillah, stopping? Amrinan kal v'chomer. Perhaps we say that it's a kal v'chomer, that it's a fortiori inference, meaning that when you have something that doesn't seem so obvious, it makes sense to then learn something that should be more simple and obvious from it. Kriyat Shema deoraita posek, Hallel derabbanan mibaya. If when we have the recitation of the Shema, where you are allowed to interrupt for the recitation in your recitation of the Shema in order to greet someone, Hallel, which is deoraita, right? The recitation of the Shema is understood to be a Torah level commandment. Hallel, which is considered to be a D'Rabbanan mitzvah, a mitzvah only that is on the obligation or rabbinic level of obligation. Is it even a question? Of course, right? If you're able to interrupt for something that's deoraita, of course you should be able to interrupt for something D'Rabbanan. The alternative answer is Odilma, presuming Nisa Adif. Or perhaps maybe that's actually not the case, and the fact that Hallel and Kriyat Megillah both have the purpose of publicizing the miracle, which is something that is considered to be very important and is related to us saying Al Hanisim and related to a lot of things that we do on Hanukkah with regard to Hanukkah candles and Purim with regard to reading the Megillah, is publicizing the miracles that happen to us. Maybe that is of such importance that actually supersedes the presumed prohibition to talk and also leads to a stricter halacha than with regard to the recitation of the Shema. The ultimate answer is posek ve'ein b'kach klum. You can pause and there isn't considered to be an issue with it. And so while this could be a great larger discussion about different priorities in halacha, specifically what I want to take out of here is the implication of what Hallel is. It's not even an implication, it's explicit. Hallel derabanan, right? Hallel is stated to be of only rabbinic obligation, and therefore we see very different images that come out of Tanit versus Brachot. So that's our second source. And now we're going to see our third source from Masechet Pesachim, which is a little bit a better way of saying all over the place. A nice way of saying that. Neither here nor there or everywhere, a little bit more of a nuanced image, a complex perspective, we'll put it like that. So let's look at Masechet Pesachim. So we're actually picking up in the middle of a discussion. We had sources before this, we had opinions before this in the Gemara that suggest that we're talking about the topic of Hallel here. Now that is our main topic here in Masechet Pesachim. That is what this part of Masechet Pesachim is discussing. And there is a discussion about whether the words of Hallel actually originated in Tehillim being composed by David HaMelech, whether King David was the actual person who first thought of these words, or whether they actually came earlier. And now we're looking at an opinion of someone who said that they came earlier, there's another dissenting opinion that we're not even looking at that said that the words originated with David HaMelech. And I'll just say, if the words originated with David HaMelech, what would that seem to imply, or where would that lead us to in terms of whether the recitation of Hallel is a Torah level commandment or a rabbinic commandment? Where could it lead us?
Rabbinic, because
Say more.
Rabbinic because he's after.
Right, because how could there be a Torah level commandment to say something, to recite something that came after the Torah? That's actually a whole separate discussion, which I wanted to get into today, but I realized we did not have time to get into today, with regard to whether the recitation of Hallel is in essence one of singing God's praises, or is actually one of like reading a specific text. Is it about reading something specific that speaks to a specific event, in which case the words that we're saying are actually essential to the mitzvah of Hallel, or is it just about some sort of spontaneous or not spontaneous, like explosion of praise, where the words that we're saying are somewhat incidental, in which case maybe the mitzvah of Hallel could be deoraita, even if the words came later, because it's about the praise and we're just filling it in, which relates to an opinion about with regard to our tefillah that we have. When we daven, it's possible, and this is the opinion that seems to come out of the Rambam, that the davening that we do, the act of tefillah, the act of prayer, is something that is biblically ordained, even if the actual words that we're saying come later. But there's a certain act that is considered to be a mitzvah d'oraita, and then there's the content, which is filled in later. But that's a bit of a parenthetical. So now let's actually look in Masechet Pesachim, which I think is very interesting here, what we see. Tanu Rabbanan. Our sages taught, Hallel zeh mi amaro. So the words of Hallel that we have, who initially said it? And now we're going to have different opinions. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Moshe Yisrael amruhu b'sha'ah she'amdu al hayam. Okay, so the first opinion is that Hallel was recited by Moshe and Bnei Yisrael when they were standing by the sea. We're talking about Kriyat Yamsuf, about the splitting of the sea, where they said, Hamamru lo lanu Hashem lo lanu. From Psalm 115, part of Hallel, that those were words that they said there, that please give glory to your name, not for us. And then Meshiva Ruach HaKodesh v'amra lahen lema'ani eseh, that the divine spirit, this Ruach HaKodesh, responded to them, for my own sake, I will do it. Okay, so there was this like we're now seeing this added beyond the shira, beyond the song that was that of Hashirat Hayam. We're seeing something beyond that here, which is the words of Hallel, in the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yehoshua v'Yisrael amruhu b'shah she'amdu alehen malchei Kanaan. Here we're seeing that there's another opinion from Rabbi Yehuda that when the Jewish people were standing against, when Bnei Israel were standing resilient after defeating the Malchei Kanaan, they recited the same thing. Hemamru lo lanu u'meshiva v'chule, and this Ruach HaKodesh came out again and said, it'll be for my sake, it'll be for my sake. And now we have another opinion. We're going later. We're now going to the times of the Shoftim. Rabbi Elazar Amodai Omer, Devora u'Barak amruhu b'shasha amad alehem Sisra. That they said it when Sisra stood against them. Hemamru lo lanu v'ruach hakodesh meshiva v'omer lahem lamani aseh. So we have the same interaction that's happening 3 different times. And now we have a 4th time. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Chizkiah v'siyato amruhu b'sha'asha amad aleim Sancheriv. So when Sancheriv stood against them, which is discussed in Malachim, Hemamru lo lanu u'meshiva v'chule, and the Gemara says, and the same response happened again. And now we have yet another opinion. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Hanania, Mishael, Zaria, Amruhu, B'shasha, Amad, Alehem, Nebuchadnezzar, HaRasha. So as the events described in Sefer Daniel, when King Nebuchadnezzar was standing against them and throwing them into the Kishana Eish, etc., into the fiery pit, etc., they then said this too. The same thing, the same formula, lo lanu, and the same divine spirit responded. And then we have another opinion, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, Mordechai ve'Esther amruhu b'shasha amad alein Haman harasha, that these words actually originated later with Mordechai and Esther, when Haman stood against them, and we have the same formula there too. Okay, so we have all of these suggestions of when the words of Hallel were first recited, some before David HaMelech, some after David HaMelech. And so the actual timing of when these words originated seems very unclear. And I also think what's interesting to note here is that it doesn't seem in all of these cases that it is so obvious what they were saying this as a response to. Were they saying it as a response to, in some of these cases, it seems like it might have been after some sort of salvation, but in others it seems like they were sort of davening to Hashem. They were praying to Hashem, Lo lanu, don't do it for us, don't do it for us, do it for you, not as a sign of praise necessarily, but almost as a plea. So Hallel that we might typically associate with this happy praise is actually seems to originate not only in that, but also in really distressed plea for salvation. Then we see a last opinion by the sages, by the Chachamim. So we have all these individuals who said when the words of Hallel were first stated. And then the Chachamim say as follows: Nevi'im shebeinahen tiknu lahem l'Yisrael sheyu omrin oto al kol perek v'perek ve'al kol tzara v'tzara shelo tavo alehem l'Yisrael. L'chshani galin omrim oto al gulatan. So this is what now the Nevi'im are taking what we read and sort of, the Chachamim are taking what we read and sort of synthesizing it, and also simplifying it, that it's not that these words were actually decided upon seemingly, or the practice of Hallel was decided upon. It's a little bit ambiguous by the prophets. So we're talking about something that happened during the time of the prophets specifically, that we should be saying it al kol perek v'perek. We should be saying it in certain time periods. So there's certain time periods where we should dafka be saying Hallel, and also on every tzara. So it's not associated with only with the positive, as we see. It's associated with certain times of year. It's associated with times of struggle. And then finally, it's also associated with redemptive moments. In those redemptive moments, we say it as praise. And before that, we sort of say it as prayer, and saying it regularly, al kol perek v'perek, throughout different times of year. It's a question of what the nature of Hallel is in those instances. So the picture that emerges from this source, from Masechet Pesachim, is, if we're going by the sages, which seems to be a definitive opinion here, that this was instituted by the prophets. So that means it doesn't quite have the level of rabbinic, and it also doesn't quite have the level of a Torah obligation. We're a little bit somewhere in the middle, but we also see there's all these opinions that the words that were stated were actually stated first, earlier, for the original miracle that befell the Jewish people. So what we see is a bit muddled, as I said, that the image of what the status of Hanukkah is, and even, sorry, of Hallel is, we'll get to Hanukkah, of what Hallel is, and even where it comes from, is a little bit up in the air. And if we look at later halachic decisors, and we'll actually skip down, we're about to look at the Rambam now, we see that different halachic authorities come down different ways. Which is to say that this is not only a discussion within the Gemara that some later authority in the time of the Rishonim could look at and say, okay, I can make order of this. We have a clear way of resolving this. It's actually something that is not so apparent. So the Rambam comes down pretty clearly in source number 4, that in his Hilchot Megillah v'Chanukah, which he groups together, as we saw, the Megillah and Chanukah is grouped together in the Gemara, Megillah and Hallel. Megillah and Hanukkah, Megillah and Hallel is grouped together here too. That's how he rules. The Ramban and others actually think that it is deoraita, that it is a Torah obligation, either as some sort of extension of the simcha of Yom Tov, of the happiness that we experience on our festivals, which is a question of then, okay, what do we do about Hanukkah in their opinions, which is a separate question, or that it has the status of halacha l'Moshe misinai, that it is something that we understood to be given to us with this doraita status from Moshe Rabbeinu ultimately at Har Sinai, even though we don't have any other source for it or context for it. And interestingly, the Chatam Sofer, a much more contemporary authority, suggests that it is generally Derabanan, that Hallel is generally a rabbinic obligation, but that actually maybe specifically Hallel with Hanukkah, in addition to reading the Megillah, might be an expression of something that is actually Doraita, of Torah obligation. And I think as we continue learning today, we're going to see a little bit more how that comes to light. So I just want to briefly look at this Rambam. We're going to reference it again at the end, but the Rambam says, and when the Rambam actually situates the halachot of Hallel within Hanukkah, within Megillah and Hanukkah. This is where he discusses what Hallel is, which is not, I don't think is coincidental, and others don't think it's coincidental, and we'll get to that too. He says, "B'chol yom v'yom mishmonat hayamim elu gomrin et Hallel." In each of the 8 days of Hanukkah, you recite the entirety of Hallel. U'mevarech lefanav asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu ligmor et Hallel. Bein yachid, bein tzibor. The blessing that we say now is likro et Hallel. His version is ligmor et Hallel. Whether you're an individual, whether you're in a group, afal pi shekriyat Hallel mitzvah midivrei sofrim mevarech alav asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu kederech shemevarech ala megillah va'al ha'eruv shekol vadai shel divreihem mevarchin alav. So he says, even though Hallel is derabanan midivrei sofrim, it's derabanan, it's a rabbinic obligation. Nonetheless, we still recite the bracha obligating us in doing so, which is the question of how does it mean, how are we blessing God for obligating us in something that's derabanan? And the answer is that we do it the same way we do about other rabbinic mitzvot, because anything that is a certain mitzvah that is rabbinic, we do say a bracha on, and the mitzvah generally that we are considered to be saying the bracha on is mitzvah from the Torah of lo tasur, the mitzvah that prohibits us from deviating from the words of our sages in one way or another. So ultimately, we're rooting it back to a Torah mitzvah, even though it's derabanan content, similar actually as we see with potentially Hallel and other mitzvah too, and tefillah. Aval davar shemu divreihem v'ikar siyat. We're going to skip that part actually. Okay. V'lo, and now we're in halacha vav, in 6 down here in English. V'lo halal shel Chanukah bilvad hu medivrei sofrim, ela kriyat halal le'olam medivrei sofrim b'kol hayamim shegormim bahen et halal. So he clarifies, when I'm saying that Hallel is derabanan, Hallel is only a rabbinic, it's not just about Hanukkah, it's about all of them. So the Rambam comes out pretty clearly with regard to the status of Hallel. So now I want to think about so we have different opinions about whether halal is deoraita or derabanan. Now that we've established that there are those different opinions, that the image of the Gemara isn't so clear, and that there's also actually a debate amongst the halachic authorities, I want us to investigate what we actually say halal on. What are the criteria for saying halal? And that takes us to our next source number 5, which is a source from Masechet Erchin, which we're gonna learn it a little bit piecemeal. We're gonna learn one part, and then we're gonna get back to it, because we're ultimately gonna get to Hanukkah here, which is gonna relate to the Sefas Emes too. And we see here that there are 18 days. 18 yamim sheyachid gomer bahen et halal. That there are 18 days that a person says halal on. What are those 18 days? Shmona yemei hachag. So all of Sukkot, including Shmini Atzeret. Ushmona yemei Hanukkah, the 8 days of Hanukkah. That gets us up to 16. The Yom Tov Harishon shel Pesach. We're talking about in the context of Eretz Yisrael, that gets us up to another day. Ve Yom Tov shel Atzeret, and also Shavuot. So then we have 18 days. And then in the Gola, in the diaspora, we have 21 days, because we add on extra days for Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiot, for the second day of Yom Tov that we keep. And now the Gemara is going to try to unpack what makes these days different from another, that some we say halal for all of them, some we don't, and also what about other days? So first, the Gemara says, "Ma'ishna bechag damrinan kol yoma, u'ma'ishna de Pesach delo amrinan kol yoma." So on Sukkot we say halal every day. On Pesach we don't. What's the deal with that? Answer: Dechag chalukin b'korbanotehen, de Pesach ein chalukin b'korbanotehen. That on the special korbanot that we bring, that are a musaf offering on Sukkot, are a different number every single day. They're not uniform. They're in descending order. And that means, for some reason in the Gemara, that makes it worthy of saying halal each day. Whereas for Pesach, it's the same korban every day. It's the same korban musaf every day. And therefore, that means that it sort of disqualifies it from halal. And now we ask about something else. What about Shabbat? Shabbat, de chalukah b'korbanoteiha lema. Shabbat, we do have a special musaf offering for Shabbat, so why don't we say it then? Answer: lo ikri moed. It's not referred to as a festival. So far it seems like we have 2 criteria that come out for when we say halal. One is that it's a day that has its own unique musaf offering, and 2, it's called a festival. Okay, so now we're going to see another suggestion. What about Rosh Chodesh, which we discussed earlier, is only a minhag to say, is only a customary to say, a binding custom, but nonetheless a custom. Rosh Chodesh de ikri moed lema. So Rosh Chodesh is called a moed. Rosh Chodesh is referred to as a festival. So why don't we say it? Lo ikdish b'yasiyat malacha. So now we have another criterion, which is the prohibition of doing labor, of doing work on that day. So Rosh Chodesh doesn't have that. So now we have 3 criteria: korban, some sort of special offering; 2, that's called a festival; and 3, that you don't do malacha, that you don't do work on it. We're gonna now ask about the next case. So, okay, fine. The Gemara is like, okay, I get everything so far, but Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, de'ikru moed, ve'ikdush be'asiyat malacha lema. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur seemingly meet all of those criteria. So why don't we say halal on those days? Answer: Mishum de Rabbi Abahu, Dama Rabbi Abahu, Amru Malachi Sharit Lifnei Kodesh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, Pnei Ma Ein Yisrael Amrum Shira Lefanacha B'Rosh Hashanah V'Yom Kippurim. So that the angels, the ministering angels, said, "Hey, what are those people down there doing? Why aren't they singing to you? Why aren't they giving you praise?" Amar lahen, Hashem said to them, "Afshar Melech Yoshev al Kiseh Hadin v'Sifrei Chaim v'Sifrei Meitim Ptuchin Lefanav v'Yisrael Amrim Shira Lefanai." Could it be that when I'm dealing with these really intense moments of judgment, is that a time for praise? And that seemingly is what disqualifies Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur from halal. So it seems like there's this additional element, which is that the day can't be too heavy. The day can't be too heavy. That would seemingly disqualify it from halal as well. So those are the criteria that we have so far. I think the question that at least I have from this is, what is it about having these like sanctified festivals that how does that relate to Hallel? What's the connection between those? And so for that, we can turn to this next source number 6 in Masechet Shabbat, where I'm gonna skip to the second line here. Amar Rabbi Yossi, hi chalki megomrei halal b'chol yom. Rabbi Yossi says that my portion should be among those who say Hallel every day, seemingly that it's something praiseworthy to say Hallel every day. Now the Gemara says, Ini, is that really the case? V'ha'amar mar, hakoreh Hallel b'chol yom, harei ze mecharef u'megadef. It's one who says Hallel every day. It's as if you're cursing and blaspheming God. So there's this idea here that comes out that saying Hallel every day is actually very, very bad. It's as if you're cursing God. And so then the Gemara says, no. When Rabbi Yossi said that, he didn't mean people actually saying full Hallel. He just meant saying Psukei de Zimra, the part of daily prayer that we say that is praising God, that actually includes the words Hallelu, Hallelujah, all of that. That is what he was referring to, not actual Hallel. But what emerges from here is that there's a problem with saying Hallel every single day. And so how Rav Yair Khan reads this Gemara is that he says that there is actually, we need to have routine, and then we also need to have a disruption to our routine. So the idea of these holy days, these Moadim, these Mikrai Kodesh, is to disrupt the general routine that we have and to get us into this consciousness of gratitude, of Hallel. And if we were to do it every single day, it would be lost, that there's something about the specialness of these days that makes it a time where we can actually pull back and really praise God wholeheartedly in a way that we actually can't do every single day. Because these days, these holy days are a way to sanctify the mundane. If you say Hallel every day, then there's nothing special to sanctify days that are special with anymore, is essentially the idea. That if you simply say Hallel all the time, you lose something about the specialness of the times that we actually do say Hallel. Kind of similar to like saving specific holiday foods, right, for specific holidays, because there's the special association with them. Then if you have, I don't know, kreplach, let's say, I don't know, every single day, it no longer makes it special if you're a type of person who has kreplach at specific times of the year, for example. And so Hallel seems to be the same case. So, okay, just to summarize so far, we get that Hallel is on specific special times where there is a special offering. It's called a festival. There is no malacha being performed. There's no labor being performed. And also it's a day that is not too somber. And so full Hallel and Hanukkah doesn't really meet any of those criteria except for the not too somber part, right? But if all these other days were being disqualified for not being a festival, for having malacha done on them, for not having a special offering, Hanukkah has none of those. So what is going on with Hanukkah? And we're now going to return to the Gemara in Erechim in source 7, which follows the discussion that we saw above about different holidays. The Gemara says, "V'cha Hanukkah zelo hachi v'lo hachi v'ka'amar mishum nisa." Okay, so Hanukkah has none of these. Hanukkah's got nothing of these that we were talking about, and yet, because of the miracle, what we're told is because of the miracle, we do recite Hallel, that the miracle is enough. So seemingly now we have another criterion, which is not part of the other ones, which are all necessary conditions, but rather a whole separate system, which is miracle, great. I'll say as an aside, we have a little bit of a question there because there were actually miracles that occurred on all of these holidays as well. We won't get into that now. That's actually, it's a much bigger question. But for some reason, the miracle of Hanukkah is something that makes it very distinct. And so this seems a little bit shocking, I think, that suddenly we are doing away with all the criteria that we were using to determine when to say Hallel when it comes to Hanukkah and just say simply Mishum Nisa, no further questioning. That's it. Because of the miracle, we don't need to know anything else. And I think that I want to move on to the Sefas Emes and what he has to say about this. But first, I just want to very briefly look at what the Gemara has to say about what Hanukkah is. The sugya in Masechet Shabbat that unpacks what Hanukkah is begins with the question, what is Hanukkah? And the narrative that is told is one of days where we're not supposed to. It's taken from Megillat Ta'anit from the scroll of Ta'anit, which discusses various days. And what we're told is, okay, what Hanukkah is about is the kingdom of the the Greeks, the Seleucids coming forth, impurifying everything, and then the Hashmonaim overcoming them. And then ultimately, this is where we see the Nes Pach Hashem and the miracle of the cruse of oil that was found, which was the pure oil that was found amongst all of the impure oil, which was then used and lasted 8 days. And I just want to note that what the Gemara says is, L'shana acheret, for the next following years, Kva'um ve'asaum, Yamim tovim behalal v'hoda'ah, that these days are characterized as some sort of Yamim Tovim, good days, and Lavdafka, a Yom Tov, right? Not really a proper Yom Tov, but these special days of Hallel and Hoda'ah. So these days are characterized by Hallel. That's what we see about the origin of Hallel in the Gemara. Okay, so with all of that said, I now want to get into the Sefas Emes. So I think that we see from what we learned so far that Hanukkah is a little bit of a misfit in terms of Hallel, and yet also the fact of the miracle of Hallel, of Hanukkah, seems to be part of the miracle of Hanukkah, and Hallel seem to be very connected in how the Gemara describes Hanukkah. But yet it still is not, everything doesn't fully fit yet. And I think through learning the Sefas Emes, we will get a better picture of what's going on here. So the Sefas Emes is Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter of Gur, or Ger, and his Torah is Torah that I grew up with. In my house, he's known as a Hanukkah Sefas Emes, and whenever I have the opportunity to teach him, I get very excited. And like, I don't know if my dad is here right now, but I always feel like I'm bringing my dad nachas, so shout out. Thanks, Dad. And now let's learn a little bit. I think this is a really profound and beautiful Torah that makes me think of Hanukkah in a different way. And so he starts off saying, and he's writing this on the first night of Hanukkah, Hanes de Hanukkah haya ba'or. The miracle of Hanukkah was with light. V'hu limtso ha'hara hagnuza gam b'choshech u'v'galut. That the miracle of Hanukkah, what makes the Hanukkah miracle consists of finding the radiance hidden, or the hidden light, also within darkness and exile. That is the content of the miracle of Hanukkah. It's not about the miracle of the oil. It's sort of riffing off that. It's specifically about finding this light. And we're going to delve in and see a little bit more what he means there. ובזה יש לומר מה שכתב אדוני אבי זקני, מורי זיכרונו לברכה. So from this, we can now connect it to something that his grandfather said. His grandfather, Rav Ichimar Alter, the founder of Hassidic Gur, who was known as the Rim, who actually raised him. The Sefas Emes' parents died when he was young, and he was raised by his grandfather. And so he now connects it to a teaching of his grandfather. Al Gemara, de bepurim lo kavu halal da akate avde da achashverosh v'chule. He's now connecting it to a Gemara that we're going to look at now, which is immediately kicking off from where we left off, with the Gemara establishing that on Hanukkah we say Hallel because of the miracle. The Gemara then says, okay, what about Purim? We had a miracle there. So now we're going to go down and then we're going to go back. Now we're in Masachet Erchin again. So continuing from that point, Hanukkah de lo hachi v'lo hachi v'ka'amar mishum nisa. Hanukkah, which is neither here nor there, it doesn't have the other obligations, that doesn't have the other criteria that other days we say Hallel have. Nonetheless, we say Hallel because of the miracle. Purim de'ika nisa lema. Purim also is a big miracle. Why don't we say it then too? And the Gemara gives 3 different answers. Unfortunately, I think at this point we do not have time to go through all of them. I wanted to, but if anyone wants to learn this on their own afterwards, I highly encourage it. There's a lot to say about what these different opinions are getting at. We're going to just simply look at the last one, which is in the name of Rava, where Rava says, Bishlama hatam halalu avdei Hashem velo avdei, halalu avdei Hashem velo avdei paro. That when we're talking about Hallel in general, we're able to praise Hashem as servants of Hashem and not as servants of Paro, not as servants of Pharaoh, which is going back to the original miracle of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which was discussed immediately before this in the Gemara, that that we were in the miracle of Yetziat Mitzrayim, we were able to fully praise God with Hallel, seemingly the Gemara thinks here. The Exodus, in the time of the Exodus, because we were able to say full-throatedly that we are the servants of Hashem. Hallelu of Hashem, servants of Hashem should praise him. Hacha, Hallelu of Hashem, velo of Achashverosh, akati avdei Achashverosh anan. We cannot actually say the same thing here referring to Purim, because we are still servants of Achashverosh. So we can't wholeheartedly say Hallelu of Hashem, because we are still actually servants of Achashverosh. The Hanukkah, the miracle, no, not Hanukkah, Purim, we're on Purim now, Leora. The Purim miracle happened. It was a hidden miracle. And what happened was we were saved. What didn't happen was some sort of overthrowing of the yoke of Achashverosh. We were still ruled by Achashverosh. It was just, we weren't killed during it. And there wasn't this, and this speaks to, in general, not only the time of Achashverosh, but also generally speaking, we are now in a time, it's considered to be in a time of exile, wherein we are still under the whims still in a situation of shibud malchiot. We're still in a situation in which there are kingdoms that are ruling over us. And we, therefore, seemingly cannot really say Hallelu of Hashem about a miracle that happened under that framework. Okay, so now let's go back to where we are in the Sefas Emes, where the Sefas Emes says, Sefas Emes says that his grandfather asked a question about this Gemara, that we said, okay, Purim, we don't say Hallel according to Rava because we are actually still slaves of Achashverosh. And he says, V'gam b'nei zeh lo haya yetziah uvitul lechol malchut Yavan. So also in the Hanukkah miracle, it wasn't actually the case that there was this ending of the rule of the Greeks. It wasn't so clear. It didn't happen in this like clear sense, the same way that we got rid of Paro. Rather, we resumed sovereignty, but we didn't completely nullify the kingdom of Yavan, the kingdom of the Greeks. So why doesn't that same rationale then apply to Hanukkah that applies to Purim? Shouldn't we not say Hallel on Hanukkah for the same reason that we are also still in a time of galut, that there is still a sense of exile, even though we're talking about something that happened in Eretz Yisrael, there wasn't full sovereignty in the same way, and it was also during a time that of exile that we are still in. We are still in this protracted period of exile. So why is it that the Gemara doesn't ask the same question there? And he answers, V'li hayanereli, al yadei hanes hirgishu shehem avdei Hashem, af shehayu begalut. So the answer here is something that I think is very profound, which is that the content of the miracle of Hanukkah is that despite being in exile, there was none the less a sense of feeling that they were actually worshiping God, behit galut, af betoch hachoshech, even within the darkness. And so the word galut means exile. The word hit galut means revelation, right? That there was this manifest understanding that they were worshiping God, and that itself was the miracle. That within the dark, there's this burning light of truth, that even though we're being subjugated by these other kingdoms, and even though we are really under the yoke of others, we are ultimately only experiencing ourselves as being under the yoke of heaven, and that realization in and of itself is nothing short of miraculous. And so the Sefas Emes is riffing here and saying that the Hanukkah miracle isn't about the fact that this oil lasted for 8 days necessarily, but rather, perhaps it seems that the Sefas Emes is saying that the fact that miracle, the miracle of the Nes Pach HaShemen, was understood and experienced as being a miracle, as being this revealed miracle by God, that in and of itself is the miracle. The miracle is the experience of something miraculous. And thus the revealed miracle is the fact that it felt like a revealed miracle. And if I go a step farther with this in the spirit of Hasidic wordplay, which I'm not sure that the Sefas Emes was actually intending, if we look at the words galut and hit galut, they're very similar, right? Which is something that others discuss as the connection between the word galut, exile, and hit galut, revelation. What I'm reading here, and this is just me here, but I'm reading here that what we're seeing here is almost that we can understand the word hit galut, not as revelation, but as the reflexive form of galut. That galut is exile. Hit galut would then mean maybe something along the lines of self-exile. Meaning, I think here, I'm suggesting that what happened in the days of Hashmonaim, what happened in the days of Hanukkah, was an opting out of exile, and that awareness and that consciousness was seen as something miraculous, that there was a self-exile from exile. There was a refusal to accept the conditions of exile and rather to see God as the true master, disregarding everything else. And it's that insistence on finding the light within the darkness, and that which is a negation of the exile. And that is what constitutes the miracle, is that self-exile from exile, thereby recognizing yourselves purely as servants of God and not servants of Yavan, and not servants of anyone else. The Sefas Emes then continues to say, "V'nishar gam lidorot hargasha mimasha lemala min hateva af be'olam hazeh." He says that what continues, there is something that continues for the generations, hargasha, a sense of something above nature, of something supernatural, of something transcendent, also in this world. That there is some sort of sense in Hasidic terminology or Kabbalistic terminology, reshimu, some sort of lingering aftertaste of this open, revealed miracle that is understood to be something that is supernatural, that this awareness of God, this refusal to accept any other ruler, and this feeling of this manifest revelation of God being our true master and our only master is something that happened on Hanukkah, and there's something that lasts within that on these days, that these 8 days are characterized in our lifetimes, in our world, the broken, flawed world that we live in, as days in which we have that connection. And I'll also say then that this also kind of relates to why Hanukkah is different than Purim, because Purim is all about the hidden. Esther's name is a play on Hester, on that which is hidden. Hester Panim, God's hiding of God's face. Purim is all about sort of diving into the fact that we are in a time where we don't know. And the miracle of Purim is considered to be a hidden miracle. Whereas the miracle of Hanukkah is the miracle of the Nes Pach Hashem and the miracle of the oil is considered to be a manifest miracle, an explicit miracle, a revealed miracle. And what the Sefas Emes is saying here is that the revealed miracle is that we weren't experiencing ourselves to be in a state of divine hiddenness. We experienced ourselves to be in a state of divine revelation. And that might lead to the difference of why we wouldn't say Hallel on Purim, but do say Hallel on Hanukkah, is because of that state. And now let's continue in the Sefas Emes. So now we're going to continue, but don't worry, we're almost done with what he has to say. This is a quote from Maoz Tzur, children of insight, B'nei Vina, sons of wisdom, Yemei Shmona, days of 8 or days of 8ness. They set days of song and praise from Maoz Tzur. And now he's going to do a deep reading of that words, Yemei Shmona, days of 8. The Yesh L'Dayek, and we can be precise here. Dahavale Lemimar, that it should have said Shmona Yamim. That the author of Maoz Tzur should have said 8 days. Mahu Yemei Shmona. What are days of 8 in the smichut form? Days of 8ness. Nir'ah shehem yamim bebechinat shmini. These are days that have the characteristic of the number 8. that there is that what we have here is days that hold the characteristic of eightness. Shelamala Ma'ateva. 8 being that which is the supernatural above nature. Uvachol yom yesh bechinat shmona kanal. And of all that, each and every one of the days of Hanukkah has, it's not that there's 8 days of Hanukkah, it's rather that each of the days of Hanukkah has this element, has this energy, has this character of eightness, which means something that is supernatural. And so when we're talking about the number 8, this is getting a little bit very quickly because I have 4 minutes left into Jewish numerology, which is played out very nicely by the Maharal in his work, both Tiferet Yisrael and Netzach Yisrael, that different numbers have different characteristics. 7 is understood to be nature in its completed form, which is why we have 7 days of the week. We have 7 days of the week. We have 70 nations of the world. We have 7 times 7 going up to counting the Omer. And then we have the extra day. We have the 8, which is representative of that which is an extra step above, beyond nature, the supernatural. And that is represented by extra things that happen. So the Brit Milah happening on the 8th day signifies this extra step that is taken in order to do this extra act of sanctification. And Shmini Atzeret, the final day, the end of the post-Sukkot, we have Shmini Atzeret, because after these 7 days, we need to have this extra day. God wanted us for this extra day that would be just us, the special time, etc. So that's sort of representative, the number 8, of breaking beyond the natural order of the world. And so I think the idea here is that the days of eightness is that dafka within the darkness and the galut, where the natural thing is to feel that darkness, notice the darkness, and also feel that sense of exile. We still retain a sense of awe and sanctity by remembering the revealed miracle. The revealed miracle being that in the days of Hanukkah, there was this transcendent supernatural sense of being fully Avdei Hashem. And that's what we recall now too. That is the Rishimu, that is the lingering, that is the lingering sense that trickles down through Hanukkah throughout generations, is that we have this continued sense that it was miraculous that we were able to recognize the sovereignty of God exclusively. And so even though Hanukkah are days, they're not days that are a moed, we do malacha on them, nonetheless, they're worthy of Hallel, because what makes these days miraculous is that we found them miraculous and that we continue to find them miraculous. And that in and of itself is the miracle. It's this infusion of the supernatural into the mundane. And so if we look at the source that we saw that said that it's actually a problem to say Hallel every day, we can look at that now in a different light, because what makes Hanukkah special is the very feeling that it is special, that it doesn't feel mundane. And that means that the essence of Hallel is that the essence of Hanukkah truly is Hallel. It is this praise. It is this gratitude that this day is special. And I also think then it makes sense that the Rambam discusses Hallel in general, the general halachot of Hallel in connection to Hanukkah, because Hanukkah represents Hallel. Hanukkah is the paradigm of Hallel. It is this day of Nes where we sanctify God through our praises, for the very fact that we feel the impetus to sanctify God, that we feel that we are Avdei Hashem, and as a result of that, we want to praise. And it also then makes sense why Hallel's origins are muddled, as we saw, with regard to when the words originated, whether it's D'Oraita, whether it's D'Rabbanan, because Hallel both comes from below and also comes from above in a sense. It's the acknowledgement and reminder of miracles from above that is said by those experiencing them, and now praying above them from below. But the very sense of experiencing this thing that is divine is actually something that we are experiencing here that is in itself miraculous. So the miracle is the sense of the miracle. Our Hallel is the fact that we want to say Hallel. And that's what Hanukkah is about, is finding that light in that darkness, which might sound a little bit trite, but what it really means is refusing to not see the light, refusing to accept the darkness, and tuning in to that miraculous energy, that miraculous time that we had in the time of Chashmonaim, where they refused to accept the yoke of anyone other than God, of any other king. The only yoke that counts as the king of heaven is the kingdom of heaven. And we too now experience Hanukkah as a continued refusal to accept anyone else's rule other than God's, and to also insist on seeing that light, to insist on feeling the miracles. And that in itself, that we're able to still continue doing that after all that we have faced as a people, is itself the miracle. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Yeshkaya,
you.
thank you.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to have you. It's always a pleasure to learn with Rabbanit Balinsky. Our next class is with Rabbanit Victoria Sutton on the topic of Sefer Ferat Shoshan, the life and teaching of Farah Sassoon. Happy Hanukkah and take care.